today, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to be here, and a big thank you, I should say, first to WH Partners for hosting us and for hosting this wonderful event. Growth and responsibility. Can these two ever be reconciled? That is the big question that we are going to tackle in the next 25 minutes, me and my colleagues on the panel. And of course, we very much invite also your remarks and questions, I should say, up front. Growth and responsible gambling. Are the two reconcilable? Are they partly reconcilable? And indeed, what are the tensions between those two, if there are any? And I dearly hope we're also going to disagree on some of these points, making it a bit more interesting for everybody. I would like to start with Szymon on our panel, Szymon Vincze. You have launched a big initiative by which you have intended to help people who want to self-exclude themselves from not just one or two operators, but ideally globally. What have your experiences been looking at business interests on the one hand and responsible gambling on the other?
So thank you very much for opening this tremendous panel. So, I mean, it has been almost 2 years until we have launched the initiative, and I can speak from that experience. I cannot speak that much from my long experience with the industry. I'm not that long with the industry, but from these discussions, actually, I was trying to collect feedback about the initiative which could increase the protection of the players and decrease the gambling harm of those who are really struggling to build a barrier between themselves and gambling. And even though I was meeting with very positive responses, like this is a good thing to do, and definitely the whole industry would benefit from it because we will become more sustainable, when it came down to really creating something, or when it came down to having this discussion behind the closed door of an executive meetings, that's where the things would get a bit more complicated. And I cannot speak from experience of having a final product. At that time, it was just a thought. But the overall feedback at that time was, maybe it won't go that easily through that part. And it's reasonable, because I understand that in this environment, all the safer gambling initiatives are getting a brutal assessment of profitability. But what I have to say as well is I think that after those 2 years, it has changed a little bit more. And we can see it on initiatives, safer gambling initiatives from the big players in the industry. So I am mostly positive about that we are going into the direction, into reconciliation. Perhaps a little bit idealist, but still keeping this idea of realism behind the closed doors of a boardroom meeting.
Thank you very much. And that brings us already to Dr. Maris Catania. Maris, you have worked for many years with a very reputable operator that has also gained a lot of recognition in the industry for responsible gambling initiatives. From your observations, what are the challenges between, on the one hand, striving for more growth and, on the other hand, having a credible RG policy?
I think if I had to speak to anyone who works in RG, I can identify them just because they don't sleep as much, because everything that people in responsible gambling do have total limitations, challenges, because the commercial teams are so big, and every time, like, why are you even trying to touch this VIP customer, or why are you trying to do this initiative? I think when you have a company that's looking into very short term, it is really difficult. And then in the long term, you see the results of the work that you've done. So when you see, like, okay, this customer, we weren't fined in this jurisdiction, or we managed to get a license, or we have customers that stay for longer. But again, it's very difficult to portray that in companies.
So again, when looking at this very ambitious goal of the journey to zero, as it is called at Kindred, maybe you can briefly elaborate on the notion. It must be very difficult to find that balance between satisfying shareholders who also want to see some revenues for their risk and investment, and at the other hand, you have had your position for many years where you would probably like to strive for RG excellence.
So Kindred have published the Journey to Zero, where we're reporting the revenue from harmful gambling. How we're doing this is by reporting revenue coming from people who close their account for addiction, people who self-excluded, or are showing a lot of markers of harm. It's been really good. It was received with a lot of positivity, but also with a lot of negativity. So you have some people saying, like, you're lying, or these numbers are not correct, or why are you doing this? This is far-fetched. But I think in the long run, although in the beginning it's really difficult, when you see that a lot of responsible gambling issues can actually save money. So when you look at people who self-exclude, there are a lot of customers that are self-excluding because they don't like their account. So the fact that you can look into this, helping people set up limits instead of self-excluding. So long-term sustainability, it actually helps.
Thank you very much. Dan Iliovici, he's a vice president with Rombet and formerly director of the Romanian regulator. Dan, you have introduced back then a voluntary industry code, a voluntary code of conduct regarding marketing practices. And I'd be curious to hear your experiences. On the one hand, maybe what you expected to happen, and on the other hand, what really happened in the industry.
Yes, thank you, Simon. It's a very good question, as always. And, well, the code of conduct versus what Shimon said and Marisa about intervention when people get too far into gambling, the code of conduct was meant to be a form of prevention. And it was also meant to be a sign given by the industry to the general public, even to the regulator, that they would like to be responsible in advertisement. Because we all know that, I don't know the case in every country, but there are many countries, Italy, Spain, for example, where even operators said that advertisement was too much. And I considered by that time, being the chief of regulator in Romania, that a self-regulation, a form of self-regulation, should be more effective into implementing some sort of limits to the advertisement. But unfortunately, or let's say not so badly, there were some operators who said, please remove that code from the regulator website, because we believe that it will be followed by a tough regulation based on these provisions. Although I invited them to discuss, to make it more effective, to sit down at the same table, all stakeholders, but finally they were afraid that something bad will follow.
So it wasn't really met with huge love, you would summarize.
Yes. And,
yeah. Well, that brings us finally, but certainly not least, to Hilary Stewart-Jones. Thank you for being with us. Hilary being certainly one of the most experienced persons in the industry and in gaming law, covering various senior positions and also serving as a consultant at Harris and Hagan. Now, when you look at the developments, Hilary, especially in Europe, is it still feasible to actually engage in a sustainable, profitable business, or has it really become an overkill, the new policies imposed in certain countries?
Thanks very much, Simon. Yes, it has been overkill. I'm looking at it from an operator perspective as well. I think the issue with sustainability is who sets that sustainability? Does a government set it, like in Germany? Does a player set it, or does an operator set it? But there are different judgment calls as to what truly sustainable looks like. You know, and ultimately, I don't think that's the job of a government to impose its X amount that Y person can afford to play with and lose. That should be dictated ultimately by the player, but with the operator's help to set those limits. But as in terms of sustainability, yes, there's a massive friction with the industry at the moment in terms of creating a customer base that long-term may be sustainable from a lower staking players, but in the meantime, a huge amount of tension that's caused on return to shareholders, because as companies, we have an obligation to shareholders as well, not just to customers. And certainly what I'm seeing, and I don't know what everyone else's experience is in the room or on this panel, but at the moment I am seeing great droves of people going back to the good old days, which is offshore. So, you know, we've seen Curaçao is going to be re-regulating. If Curaçao re-regulates in a way that sets the bar slightly higher than it is currently, then everyone's just going to go back to Costa Rica. And how is it then possible or feasible for operators who want to do the right thing, they want to be regulated, how can they possibly offer the product range that their offshore counterparts are offering? You know, that's the problem, is that ultimately, the harder the regulation, it actually drives poorer consumer rights and poorer consumer, you know, in terms of choices as well. And you're never going to be able to compete against that.
Thank you very much, Hilary. I would like to revisit the notion of responsibility. Our panel contrasts the two notions of business growth on the one hand and responsibility on the other. And I'd like to briefly take a step back and actually reflect on that notion of responsibility. And in that context, I remember quite an important paper at the time in 2004, as early as 2004, written by the leading researchers Blaschinski, Schaefer, and Ladouceur, who created the so-called Reno model. And according to that model, the responsibility should be a shared one between operators, players, and indeed authorities. So I'm struck by the impression that the reality nowadays is rather a unilateral responsibility, being more and more on the shoulders of the operators. And I was wondering what you, as a, working practically in the industry and also having published academically on the subject matter, what do you think of that concept of a shared responsibility?
I think when you're working in the industry, you can't do it on your own. You have to involve treatment centers, you have to involve lived experience, academics, very much so. You hear a lot of times these claims on Twitter, for example, like 60% of revenues coming from problem gamblers, or all Malta licensed operators are bad. But I think if you actually manage to look into the numbers and look into the research and speak to treatment centers, this is different. And I think we can only learn from these stakeholders.
There's certainly some learnings to be onboarded from, let's say, treatment centers and other people working in the health industry. There's also a certain risk, and I think we've discussed about this as well. There's a notion called déformation professionnelle, meaning that the perspective that you take every day in your work, you can't help applying it to a certain product or service. So, for instance, in the treatment service, if all you see are addicted persons, it's probably difficult to have a perspective on the game in the sense of many people may not have an issue with the game. And maybe from your experience, do you have some idea how many people are affected in practice of severe pathological gambling?
Well, the prevalence studies, the prevalence studies show between 0.3 to 6%. So it depends which screening tool they use and everything. But on the point of working with treatment centers, and they have a totally different view, when we invite them over, when they see what we do, when they see how people gamble, it actually enriches not just us, but even them. So they can also focus on the prevention type of thing. They can advise people, listen, there are limits online, you know, there are different things that they might not have learned in their psychology degree, you know what I mean? So I think that communication goes both ways.
Thank you very much. Dan, from your experience, also back then with the code of conduct and beyond that as a regulator, do you see a trust issue between these various stakeholders?
Yes, the short answer is yes. It's a problem of trust because ideally one should see a marriage, a happy marriage between regulators, operators, all stakeholders, mass media. But in the real life, regulators might think that operators should always do their best to attract as many customers as possible, to keep them as long as possible on their platform. On the other hand, operators might see the regulator as the guy with the stick in their hand and looking for mistakes and then applying a stitch on their hand. And the mass media is obeying what the general public is thinking about gambling, that it's evil, that everything is bad with gambling, and therefore they do not trust whatever even a good or a responsible operator should declare or do. They cannot trust him only because he's an operator.
Some difficult situations there. Hilary, I would like to come back to you. We heard the Minister of Curaçao today outlining a new regulatory regime with stricter supervision, stricter RG rules, stricter also tax substance rules having presence on the island. Will this solve the issue, or might operators simply move elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the thesis. Even if they have a period of amnesty for bad actors, ultimately there will be actors there that can't do everything in a way that their European counterparts would do, and therefore the jurisdiction will no longer be attractive for them. I mean, that's just axiomatic. But I think about the point about sustainability and having this ecosystem where we all work together rather than alienate the industry will be a desire, that I would like to see. And it's also a consistency of approach. So ironically, in terms of the US, in terms of the most litigious country in the whole world, they've got zero accountability at the moment in terms of, any sort of social responsibility obligations vis-a-vis the customers, and hence we are seeing the large revenues, particularly in sports betting. I mean, those tensions will come in due course, but they're not available, or they're not there at the moment. As I said, that's the other hard part of all of this, is that what's sustainable in one jurisdiction is not sustainable in another. So you're juggling all these different standards all the time, depending on the nationality of, well, not even the nationality of the player, but where they're actually logging on from, which seems ridiculous as well, and a really tough, as I said, it's a tough place for an operator to be these days. Beaten up at every turn, not just by, governments, but by the press and by their own regulators as well.
It's certainly in recent years an experience shared in the UK, yeah. I reckon. Simon, what is your view on what we typically would call the grey market, meaning operators not primarily seeking national licenses, but trying to address players globally with an international license from an international hub? What is your view on the development of this grey market?
Yeah, I believe that anytime soon we won't be running away from the situation that the offshore providers will be looking for ways how to make their business in a jurisdiction when they are allowed, or in the jurisdictions when they are able to squeeze in. And I think it's also because the the fragmented regulation which we have in online gambling, because there were interesting points being said regarding the distrust between the regulators and the operators, regard the need for collaboration to achieve the sustainable business and responsible gambling. So for these reasons, for me, it comes down into getting to a certain degree of best practice in the industry, of the standards of the industry, because how it works, we are in the industry which is still expanding. We have new companies, new operators, new players who want to get a piece of the cake. So what are they going to do when they start? Perhaps they will want to start in a jurisdiction where it is not so strict, where they can give a license, they can operate, they can gain some money. So how they are going to approach it? They will perhaps come to a conference and they will ask people who have experience with it, how can we do business in these emerging markets? And what they will do what these guys will tell them. So if we will be able to raise these standards, not only in the highly regulated markets, but also around the industry, what these new players, I mean operators, will be getting will be, okay, you can do business over here, you can be profitable, but there is a line. There is a certain level of player protection that you need to adhere with. There is a certain standards that you need to go with. And I think that if this collaboration, I mean this work on creating this practice will be as a mutual work of all of us, I think we can be slowly getting there, because we have regulations for single markets, but nothing that would be going globally, and I think we will never get to a global regulator.
Thank you, Szymon. Maris, we have spoken a lot about operators. Now, taking a brief look at B2Bs, you think there is a potential for improved RG policies, RG practices, by licensing B2Bs, as some jurisdictions do?
I don't think this will be a popular opinion for some, though. But one of the things that really annoys me, for example, is that you would have initiatives like GamStop in the UK, and then you have non-GamStop casinos. So literally in your face, that if you have a problem, you can gamble here. And I think the only way to actually manage these type of issues is to make sure that B2Ps also get to be regulated. Not in a harsh way that it will limit the game, but at least to make sure that they're being ethical in their business as well.
Hilary, I've mentioned the UK, which has been in spotlight for quite some years now with the review. Looking at the levels, at the sheer level of the fines in the UK, sometimes I'm wondering, is it still about the fines, or actually is it more about a political message, given these fines are so high, higher than most other places in the world? Or is it really about actual achievement of RG policies, which is often argued as a basis?
No, there's no doubt at all that there is a punitive element to the fines, rather than rectifying the so-called harms and the wrongs. And a general rule of thumb that for every transgression, the fine is only going to increase, even if the transgression by relative terms was not as major as the previous one. So undoubtedly, the operators are feeling very bloodied and bruised in the UK. We seem to have a regulator that loathes our very presence. And as I keep on saying to people throughout all of this, governments decide on whether gambling is lawful or unlawful. It's not for the regulator to determine the parameters of how that, how the operators are then allowed to carry on their day-to-day business, when in principle that something should be lawful has already been decided by government. And we've heard today there may be a tax hike again in the UK. I mean, obviously the Chancellor's looking to make as much money out of the gambling industry. And in any event, we have basically the indirect taxes of all these fines, which ironically you're going to have to hardwire into your budgets in the UK now, because you have to assume that if you're an operator, you're not going to be in 100% compliance 100% of the time. And unless you're budgeting for that in terms of your forecasting, it's not every... it doesn't matter how big the company is. A £17 million hole is a £17 million hole. You've already distributed that money by way of dividends, and you have to find, fill the hole from somewhere. So it's incredibly difficult to run, a sustainable business with that kind of pressure.
Thank you. Which slowly brings me to wrapping up our session, and I'd like to reach out to our panelists one last time with the question, so what is the way forward? Is the way forward stricter state-imposed RG policies? Is it an industry code, a voluntary industry code? Or is it a few thought leaders in the industry that take the lead and in the hope that others will follow? Shimon, your comments.
Yes, thank you. I can follow up on what I've said previously. I think that how it can be achieved is more, I think it should be done more in a natural way. If we would be if we would be building structures, if we would be building organizations, I think it will be very difficult to get everyone on board and to get this spread globally. So I think what is important is to have these leaders in the industry, and not only among the tier 1 companies, and not only among the regulators or RG associations, but also among the companies which are running this offshore business, which will be showing the value of sustainable business, showing the value of having a healthy player base, showing the value of trying to protect those vulnerable ones. When the value will be here and will be a minute for everyone in the industry, then I think we will be getting to a change. It will take years. I'm not sure if we will achieve it, but that's a way forward for me.
You know, the problem with that is always you are going to be competing against the bad actors. And when I was at Labrooks in 1997, and the day that we had our first all-nighter with a guy who played all night, people were like high-fiving one another and saying how amazing this person played for 12 hours straight. So the world has moved on massively since then. We all get it. We've all got our ESG obligations anyway. As I said, I would much prefer to see something voluntary rather than imposed from above, because one size doesn't fit all. But, you know, if you've got an aspirational voluntary code led by, you know, industry leaders, the hope is the more responsible companies will, you know, want to fall into the right side of that, or onto the right side of it.
Thank you, Hilary. And I believe in the interest of time and out of respect for the next panelist, we will have to wrap it up here. Please join me in thanking our panelists and indeed WH Partners.